There are empires that collapse in fire, and there are empires that collapse in silence. Roman Britain did not end with one final battle where the legions died heroically on the walls. It ended with something far colder, a moment when help stopped coming, a moment when the province realized that the center of the world, Rome, was no longer able or no longer willing to pay the cost of keeping Britain Roman. That is what makes the abandonment of Britain so haunting. Not that Rome lost it, but that Rome let it go. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain had been shaped by Roman hands. Roads cut through wilderness. Towns grew around forts. Markets ran on Roman coin. Local elites learned Roman habits. Walls and watchtowers held back pressure. Even when life was hard, the system existed. Britain was plugged into the empire's machine. And then, sometime in the early 5th century, the plug was pulled. When people ask, why did Rome abandon Britain? They often want a clean answer. One dramatic cause, one decisive event. But history rarely works that way. The truth is usually a chain reaction, small cracks that become fractures, fractures that become collapse, and collapse that forces impossible choices. Rome did not abandon Britain because Britain was unimportant. Rome abandoned Britain because Rome was running out of everything that makes an empire an empire: stability, money, manpower, and trust. To understand that, you have to understand what Britain was in the Roman system. Britain was a frontier province, expensive to hold, difficult to supply, and constantly exposed to pressure. In the north was the militarized zone beyond Hadrian's Wall. On the coasts were raids and piracy. Inside the province were periodic rebellions and the constant need for soldiers to enforce order. A frontier province is never simply governed. It is managed, like a wound that must be continuously bandaged. And bandages cost money, troops, ships, and administration. For centuries, Rome could afford that cost because the empire was coherent enough to move resources where needed. Britain had legions, forts, and a steady flow of pay, supplies, and authority. Even when there were problems, the system could respond. But by the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, that system began to falter. The empire entered an era where border crises were no longer occasional storms, they were constant weather. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were under pressure. Internal civil wars erupted repeatedly. Emperors rose and fell with armies behind them. Every time Rome fought itself, it weakened the structure that held provinces together. Civil war is the empire eating its own muscles. Now add distance. Britain is across water. Reinforcing Britain requires ships, ports, and coordination. When the empire is stable, coordination is routine. When the empire is chaotic, coordination becomes fragile. That fragility is the beginning of abandonment, because abandonment does not start with a formal announcement. It starts with delays. Late pay, late supplies, fewer reinforcements, undermanned forts, less safe roads, and local officials improvising. It starts when soldiers become less loyal to distant emperors and more loyal to local commanders who can actually keep them alive. This is how provinces start to drift away. Not through ideology, but through survival. And Britain had another dangerous pattern. It was a stage for usurpers. Roman generals in Britain could declare themselves emperor because they had troops, distance, and the chance to gamble while the center was distracted. That pattern mattered because each time troops left Britain to support a civil war adventure, Britain became weaker. Then raids increased. Then Rome pulled more troops out because the empire was desperate. Then local defense collapsed further. The province began to feel alone. At the same time, pressure was rising across the empire. Britain wasn't the only border in trouble. When Rome's core frontiers were threatened, Rome had to practice triage. Choose what to save, choose what to sacrifice. Triage is the most brutal form of imperial decision-making. You don't ask what you value. You ask what you can still hold. Britain was expensive to hold because it demanded constant military presence and constant sea-based logistics. It mattered, but it was not the Mediterranean core. In a collapse scenario, it becomes a luxury frontier. One you might keep when the empire is healthy, and one you might abandon when the empire is bleeding. This is the core of the day Rome gave up. The empire's problem was no longer how to rule Britain. It was how to survive at all, and when survival becomes the goal, distant provinces become negotiable. But here's the twist that makes this story painful. Rome didn't abandon Britain in a clean, planned way. Britain felt abandonment as emptiness, as shrinking authority. As a world where Roman coin becomes scarce, Roman soldiers stop arriving, and the promise of imperial protection becomes a memory. That is why Britain's end feels like silence. If you could stand on a hill in Roman Britain around the year 350, the province might still look permanent. Roads still cut through the land. Towns still traded. Villas still stood. Forts still watched the frontiers. Hadrian's Wall still stretched across the north like a scar of stone. The empire still felt real, but permanence is not stability, and stability is what Britain was losing long before abandonment became obvious. The first crack was external pressure. Britain was attacked from multiple directions. In the north, there were threats beyond the wall. Along the coast, there were raids and piracy. Multi-direction pressure is the worst kind of pressure because it demands flexible defense. Flexible defense demands manpower. Manpower demands money. And by the late Roman period, both were becoming scarce everywhere. Empires survive raids when they have surplus capacity reinforcements, repairs, reliable pay, and the ability to punish attackers and restore deterrence. But when the empire is strained, raids become signals of weakness. Signals invite more raids and encourage local elites to doubt Rome's protection. Doubt is the beginning of separation. Now add the second crack, internal politics. Britain had a dangerous habit. It could produce emperors. This meant Britain's troops were often pulled into civil wars. A commander in Britain could gamble for the throne, taking legions across the sea and leaving the frontier weaker. Win or lose, Britain paid the price. This created a cycle. Pressure rises, so Britain needs troops. Troops are pulled out for civil wars, so raids increase. Raids destabilize the province, so local leaders become more desperate and improvisational. Each loop weakens imperial control and strengthens local survival structures. And Rome was facing crisis elsewhere. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were under heavy pressure. These were core defensive lines. If they collapsed, the heartlands of Gaul and Italy would be exposed. In that context, Britain became a resource pool, a place to pull troops from and demand stability from without always providing stability in return. For Britain, each withdrawal felt like betrayal. Forts and roads are not just structures, they are messages. They say Rome is here and Rome will respond. When garrisons shrink, the message changes. The stone remains, but the certainty disappears. And certainty is what keeps elites loyal, markets stable, and taxes flowing. Once certainty fades, Britain begins to drift in practice. Town councils organize militias. Wealthy landowners fortify property. Communities rely less on imperial officials and more on local networks. This post-Roman society begins before Rome officially leaves. It begins the moment people stop trusting the center. Then comes the pay problem. The army is a paid institution. When pay becomes late or unreliable, loyalty shifts toward local patrons. Garrisons become unstable. Commanders act more independently. The province becomes patchwork. Abandonment begins as a system failing to deliver basics: pay, supplies, reinforcements, and timely response. As those basics weaken, raids become more severe and local defense becomes more independent. Britain remains Roman in architecture, but not Roman in security. By the time the final abandonment arrives, Britain is already half detached in reality. Rome is forced into triage, and triage means asking what can still be afforded. Britain is far seat-dependent and expensive. In desperate years, it becomes negotiable. There is a moment in collapsing empires when distance becomes fatal. Not because the province is far, but because the center can no longer project power outward reliably. The ports still exist. The roads still exist, but the ability to move men and money in time breaks down. That is the turning point for Roman Britain. Britain's abandonment was a logistical failure wrapped in political necessity. The Western Empire's crisis on the continent became so violent that Britain stopped being a province and became a burden. Britain required ships, safe sea lanes, and coordination. When the West became unstable, coordination became fragile. From inside Britain, the change felt like delays turning into absence. A raid hits, help arrives late, then later, then not at all. Forts go unpaid longer, reinforcements shrink, local officials improvise. Town councils hire fighters, landowners become defense leaders. Britain reorganizes without Rome, not rebellion, survival. Survival creates new loyalties. If safety comes from a local strongman, the town belongs to his world. If soldiers depend on local patrons, loyalty drifts away from Rome. If coin becomes scarce, barter returns. If taxes weaken, administration stops functioning. This is how a province leaves an empire. Without a formal announcement, it stops being managed. Rome is forced into survival mode. It no longer asks how to hold everything. It asks how to prevent total collapse. Britain is expensive and sea-dependent, and it is not the core heartland. In a stable empire, it is manageable. In a collapsing empire, it is a luxury frontier. That is the psychological shock. Britain had been Roman for centuries. Generations lived under Roman law. Towns and elites were Romanized. Rome wasn't just a distant ruler, it was the normal structure of the world. When support fades, the world's operating system shuts down. Abandonment does not mean instant conquest. Britain does not become Saxon overnight. It becomes fragmented. Some forts remain occupied for a time. Some towns hold on, but the flow of money and authority weakens beyond repair. Archaeology often shows a slow shift. Coins become rarer, urban maintenance declines, public buildings are reused, defenses are repaired locally. Meanwhile, raids continue and often intensify because deterrence is gone. As a province, you are part of a system that can punish attackers. Alone, you are a target that must negotiate survival every season. So Britain enters a long transformation into local warlords, shrinking trade, private defense, and new settlements. Rome did not abandon Britain out of boredom. Rome abandoned Britain because it was forced to choose survival, and Britain was too far to save. When Rome left Britain, it did not leave an empty island. It left a Roman-shaped world without a Roman engine. Walls remained. Towns remained. But the system behind them, pay, protection, predictable authority, was gone. Everything changed slowly and violently at the same time. Power became local. Without an imperial framework, authority fractured into smaller centers. Former Roman officers became warlords. Landowners became defense leaders. Protection became private. Law became personal. Britain became patchwork. This was not romantic freedom. It was survival politics, and survival politics is unstable. Alliances shift, rivalries harden, and communities retreat into defensible places. The economy shrank. Rome's empire ran on coin, taxation, trade, and maintenance. When coin became scarce, barter grew. Long-distance trade declined. Town life became harder to sustain. Public buildings were repurposed, stones reused, baths and forums abandoned. Not overnight, but as resources and safety disappeared. Frontiers collapsed inward. Hadrian's wall could not defend itself. Without men and supplies, it became lonely stone. Some forts held for a time, but the frontier became porous. Movement accelerated raids, migrations, settlement. New groups settled and reshaped the future over time. The island did not flip instantly, but abandonment removed the imperial barrier that once controlled movement. Some arrivals began as raiders, some as mercenaries, some as settlers exploiting weak defense. Over generations, these shifts reshaped culture and language. This is the emotional core. Rome's departure was a generational rupture. People who believed they belonged to the greatest system suddenly faced a world without that system. Identity became local. Records faded. The period feels like shadow because Rome's bureaucratic voice, the clarity of administration, disappeared. Did Rome choose to abandon Britain? In a sense, yes, because the center stopped paying and enforcing. But the deeper truth is that Rome was forced into triage. It saved what was close, rich, and defensible. Britain was far, expensive, and sea-dependent. In stable years it was manageable. In desperate years it was a frontier luxury. Britain reveals what imperial decline really looks like, not one dramatic defeat, but a gradual failure to deliver basics. Britain didn't leave Rome. Rome left Britain. And once Rome left, the empire's most powerful gift, inevitability, died quietly on the edge of the world.